Welcome to another episode of Breakthrough Dialogues, the podcast for pragmatists and problem solvers brought to you by the Breakthrough Institute. I'm Alex Trembath, your host and Deputy Director at Breakthrough. For this episode, I spoke with Bishop Garrison. Bishop is the co-founder and president of the Rainey Center, a relatively new policy research community in Washington run by and for women, minorities, and mavericks. The Rainey Center aims to build a policymaking class as diverse as America herself. And I've gotten to know Bishop a bit over the past year, mainly because of some shared goals of Rainey and the Breakthrough Institute. A depolarized American politics, and environmental and other policy that is relevant and impactful for all Americans. Bishop is also an Army veteran, and he served in the Obama administration. Bishop Garrison, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Very happy to be here with you guys today.
Happy to have you. I want to start by asking you to tell us who Joseph Rainey was.
Sure. He was the first African-American congressman of the United States. He represented South Carolina. He was originally from Georgetown, South Carolina. He was himself the son of a slave. His father is incredibly interesting. He worked as a barber, and his owner allowed him to save some extra money and tips that he received from his work. And after years, he saved up enough to buy not only his own freedom, but that of his family. So that's how Joseph Rainey became a free man. And during the period of Reconstruction, years later, when we were doing all we could to, at least at the beginning phase of righting the original sin, making it correct again in the country, he had the opportunity to serve his nation, and he stepped up and did so. So he's an incredible figure in American history for all of us, a true leader. And there's more that I could go into on that. You could probably take up this entire podcast talking about Congressman Rainey, but that's why we see him as such an important
Right. So obviously
figure.
You and your co-founder, Sarah Hunt, named the Rainey Center after Joseph Rainey. Our listeners may not know, as it's a relatively new outfit. So can you tell us what is the Rainey Center? What is your mission?
Sure. So in this time of hyper partisan politics, Sarah and I met a few years back. She and my wife went to the same law school. That's how we actually ended up meeting. But Sarah has been for a long time in Republican politics, but in policy working on issues of climate change and renewable energy. And we had a lot of healthy discussions throughout the years, and we understood that though we came from completely different backgrounds from an ideological and political perspective, we were still able to come together as incredibly close friends and understand each other's perspectives and be able to have dialogue without being in each other's throat. And that's something particularly right now in the United States, you don't necessarily see that often. So as we were both kind of in a transition period a little over a year ago, we were trying to determine what we could do as individuals and as a team to try to honestly make the country and society right now a little better, and at least recreate that working relationship between the partisan divide on so many incredible issues. We recognize that no one side has all the answers to any problem. It's going to take individuals working together to really come together and forge solutions to all those issues that ail us. And that's what the Rainey Center is about. We call it post-partisan. At some point in the future, we hope that our country really does get beyond all partisan politics and really simply looks for the absolute best ideas whenever it's dealing with its problems. But here in the short term, we understand that the work we do is bipartisan, and we do everything we can not only to bridge that gap, but also to do so in a way that creates new and greater opportunities for people of color and for women as well. The other part to the equation for us is anytime we would go into our own different political spheres, we would not see a lot of people that looked like us. That is to say, when I would attend events in national security and foreign policy, I often stood out as the only African-American man. And when she went to events that were more on the conservative side for energy and environmental issues, she was one of the few women. So we want to do everything we can to create more opportunities for those young people that are interested in serving their country and engaging in these types of issues.
So I want to return to that because I think it's super important, this idea of making a more inclusive political and policy class. But I want to dig in first to the distinction you just drew between bipartisanship and post-partisanship. So can you unpack that a little bit more for us and tell us what you mean by the hope for a post-partisan future? Are we talking about a future without political parties, or are we talking about something else?
Well, that's what I see. I mean, and again, like we're talking about a thing that at best is a generation away, I think. But the idea is really that I don't think it was ever necessarily the intent of the founders to have a political system in which it was purely driven by a personal or a particular group's singularly focused ideologies on a variety of issues. I think what we really want to see is the best solutions, the best ideas always, become the cream of the crop, and they rise to the top of our debates and our dialogue. And to me, that's what post-partisanship really is about, is a political system in which the best candidates, the best individuals to represent the interests of their communities and of their areas are the ones who are voted on. And it doesn't matter whether there is no blue or red or green at that point. There's only the best ideas and the best people who truly want to be servants of their community. That's the way we view post-partisan. So when I say bipartisan, I really mean the two major parties, Democrats and Republicans, doing everything they can to work together to find a smart, innovative solution to the problems that our country faces. And I think that is, at least in the short term, what we all should be striving towards. And I say this as a political animal with my own blue stripes proudly. But at the same time, I absolutely understand that Democrats are never going to have the solutions to absolutely every situation. And Republicans, the same thing is true. So we need to come together and work within the system that we have right now. And unfortunately, you're just absolutely not seeing that. Now, we can argue for a variety of reasons why that may not be happening, whether it's more on one party or on the other. But the truth of the matter is that it exists. That problem of hyper-partisan politics right now is a true thing, and we need to be working to get away from that.
I mean, I'd certainly agree. So that's the vision. That's the mission. What does the work of the Rainey Center look like? You mentioned you work on a whole bunch of different policy issues, but what is the sort of concrete work of the organization?
So for us, we work in several policy areas, particularly right now, as I've kind of harped on energy and environment, to include some climate security pieces, how climate change affects our national security operations. We're also looking into more issues of national security, issues of tech and innovation. There are a lot of different things as we see more and more in the news with things like AI, with facial recognition and other biometrics, and how they actually are affecting a variety of communities and federal operations, and the corporate entities, how they are using aggregated data, and how they deal with law enforcement and work with the government. So those are, are really our tier top three. But then we're also working on what we refer to as inclusive governance. And that really means doing everything we can at the state, local, and federal levels to ensure that we have a government that reflects and quite frankly, looks like those that it serves. And I don't think we have right now the best overall representation of women, of people of color, of the LGBTQ community within all three areas of our government throughout the country. And that's something that the Rainey Center is continuing to look at and speak about and work on.
Yeah, so it's, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you was because it's part of the work of the Breakthrough Institute to depolarize environmental politics and sort of environment and power focus.
Yes.
Environment is one of your focuses. It's a reason that I was so thrilled to see Rainey launch last year, out there doing sort of consonant and in many ways more dedicated work in that area. I will be honest, though, the last few years have not given me a lot of hope for either bi or post-partisanship. So can you speak to the sort of moment that we as a nation are in right now, whether you are hopeful or not, and how you see a path forward?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you, I'm always an optimist, even if I'm a pragmatist. While I have my optimism, but I remain ever hopeful. The moment that we find ourselves in, quite frankly, to your point, I think maybe something you're alluding to a bit is when it comes to the environment, when it comes to climate, we're at a crisis point. We're looking at a variety of scientific facts and research that tell us that, I believe some of the best outcomes list by 2050, if we don't make some significant changes, we, for all intents and purposes, won't have a planet that's livable. And we see some very drastic ideas on what action should be taken when you look at the new Green Deal and some of the other more progressive stances. There is a chasm right now between what the two sides politically believe we should be doing to properly engage in this crisis, in this crisis. And that in and of itself is an enormous problem. The way I attack it, the way I look at the issue of climate change is from, as I mentioned before, the climate security piece. And that is really more about how the national security apparatus in total reviews the significance of climate change. And we're having some cognitive dissonance whenever you hear the way the Department of Defense and the intelligence community has framed climate change since I would say the early to mid 1970s to now, versus what you're seeing from our current administration, unfortunately, from typically more conservative voices of, the jury's still out on whether or not climate is an actual issue. And that's just not true. Science tells us that it is an enormous issue that has been of our own creation, that continues to plague us and is only going to get worse if it's not affected. From the national security perspective, it is going to affect and has already begun to affect our operations, both home and abroad, when we see everything from coastal erosion and having Coast Guard and naval forces having to deal with that, to actually the future of resource wars. And you see in places like Africa and other nations, we're probably 5 to 10 years away from seeing all-out wars over everything from food to water to energy and to mineral resources. So I say all of this and probably make somewhat of a dramatic call, but a dystopian idea of what the world looks like, if you will. But I think it's incredibly important for people to understand that this is the point in which we're at, that if we don't take some drastic steps that are aligned in actionable solutions within legislation, within federal policy, we're going to find ourselves in more than just a simple predicament. We may find ourselves without an actual sustainable planet to live on.
Yeah, and listeners will know that I'm very much of the same stripe as you. I am pretty optimistic, despite everything, about sort of bipartisan action towards climate change. I've talked on this podcast before about things like bipartisan consensus around clean energy RD&D. Obviously, there's the work from the Department of Defense and the national security community around resilience to the impacts of climate change. So I do see sort of progress there and reasons for optimism. Do you think, despite, I don't know, the Trump administration and the general tenor of the Republican Party, that things like dealing with impacts to climate change, things like sort of a commitment to clean energy innovation are areas for progress and for partnership?
Well, I would say, I don't know if you saw, and I'm sure you did. I know there's a lot going on, but the news today came out that the White House is, at least from the NCA perspective, backing off right now on having a red team that reviews climate science. So that, I think that's an initial, win for common sense, so to speak.
Yeah, for context, the red team was this idea that came up a year or two ago. First maybe in the Department of Energy, that the administration was trying to put together a red team, as it's called, of folks to sort of poke holes in the pretty strong scientific consensus around climate change that pervades the sort of civil side of the government, and the career side. So just a little bit of context there.
Yeah, exactly. And I apologize for not kind of adding that, just kind of saying that up. But exactly, it was a red team that was going to be questioning what is considered by many to be scientific fact within the community at this point, when you have something like a consensus of 97% of all climate scientists saying that climate change is real. They were actually going to attempt to play devil's advocate and poke holes in the idea that climate change is not taking place. And that plan, for the time being, seems to have been abandoned. So that is at least a start for me. Now, the other pieces that we see where there's been a lot of rolling back of Obama-era policies that allow for more robust investment in clean energy, particularly when you look at solar, when you look at wind energy, and you've had some of the comments the president has made about, what happens if the wind stops blowing, like those types of issues, they concern me. So I think there is a lot that needs to take place and needs to be said before I'm going to believe that this is an administration that's interested in having more robust efforts within the investment for these types of technologies. But that doesn't mean it can't happen or won't happen. They have changed their mind on these different issues in the past, just as this recent news illustrates. So I would hope that we would continue to see some type of discussion and effort internally that allows for additional changes as well.
I want to get into the high level politics from Rainey's perspective, and if you'll allow me for a little bit of a wind up here. I buy an argument that I've seen, and I'm not a political theorist, but what I've been able to glean, and that I totally buy, is that both the left and the right in America kind of have legitimate grievances right now. So broadly, the American right is more dominant in political power. Obviously, they control the White House, majority on the Supreme Court, one house of Congress, and control sort of most state houses and most state legislatures. They did that even throughout most of the Obama years. And so the sort of American left feels sort of locked out, or feels disadvantaged on the political terrain. On the other hand, I think it's pretty fair to say that the sort of American progressive left, more or less, has more of a monopoly in for lack of a better word, culture, film and television, marketing and major corporations, attitude in cities and major centers of commerce. So the observation has been made that while the sort of American right is maybe at an advantage in politics, the sort of American progressive left, or whatever you want to call it, has maybe a bit of an advantage in culture. And if you don't buy that, then let me know. But I guess my question is, if politics is downstream of culture, and half of all Americans feel aggrieved and alienated from the other half on at least cultural, if not political grounds, then how do we bridge that?
Sure. Well, I would. I think it's a very interesting question. I would, argue whether or not I believe it's half. I think right now, when you really look at how people define themselves politically, it's cut up into thirds. with independents, Democrats, and Republicans. So you see, and actually, I think the largest percentage right now of the way voters identify is independent.
Mm-hmm.
So, which makes for a very interesting point, because you see more and more, and particularly with the younger half of the electorate, you're seeing more and more that individuals are very much more socially open than we've seen in previous generations. But I think there's still room for debate on how they feel in terms of fiscal responsibility and how they address economic issues. I've always been the idea of, I think it was Colin Powell was the first person I ever really heard frame it as socially, fiscally responsible with a social conscience. Understanding that there was always going to be a need for the state to create or produce social programs that helped vulnerable communities. But at the same time, we needed to go about doing that in such a manner in which we didn't create more economic strife for ourselves in the long run. With all of that said, I think that there is, and there always has been to some degree, a more of a cultural liberalism within entertainment, particularly when you talk about the arts of all types. So I don't think that that's that surprising now than it would have been 10, 20, even like as far as 50 years ago. And I think to some degree within our country, we've always seen somewhat of a socially conservative, I don't want to say dominance, but definitely a strong voice politically, more so than we have on the liberal side. Because when you look at liberalism, a great deal of it is created, quite honestly, by marginalized and vulnerable communities. So they wouldn't be marginalized and vulnerable if they had the stronger political voice
Right.
to begin with. So if we frame it in that perspective, I think that there's still always going to be an opportunity to bridge that gap. And it really comes back to independence, particularly given all the things that we're seeing right now today with the issues at the border, the issues with our diplomacy. The ambassador to the United States from the UK just had to step down today because he had comments about the administration and called them inept. We see a lot of political strife and cultural strife happening right now that is forcing a lot of people to really review their political stances and take a hard look at, how they want to be represented and who they want to represent them. And they're moving more towards the center in a lot of aspects, particularly from the conservative side. I think that's how this gap is going to be bridged. I think in the long run, you're going to see more people that like a lot of the different policies and platforms that both sides have to offer on various issues. And that's how we're going to get a more accurate representation of the interests of the American people overall.
I said I wanted to be sure to get back to this. You say the aspiration of Rainey is to see more diversity in public policy and build a policy leadership community for women, minorities, and mavericks. Again, this is...
Sarah says Mavericks. I always argue with her about that.
I was actually going to ask where Mavericks came from. Due credit to Sarah.
Yeah, that's all Sarah.
But this, as I said, this is something that you and I have talked a little bit about offline and in the past. The goal of not just sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion broadly, but in making the work of the Breakthrough Institute or making the work of the Rainey Center sort of relevant and impactful to as wide a community and as wide a constituency as possible. For Breakthrough and eco-modernism, it's pretty critical if we think that we are a more relevant and a more pragmatic form of environmentalism, that we are actually reaching and actually including more than just sort of well-off white people. So can you talk a little bit about what the work of that looks like at Rainey?
Yeah. So for us, it's, and again, for you guys and for your listeners, Rainey has only existed for a slightly over a year. So we're still building towards a lot of these different types of solutions. I'll tell you one thing that as we build out on our funding, and we continue to develop our relationships that we think is an actionable solution to actually leading towards the type of stated goals we want to obtain is producing a fellowship in which we help identify particularly young women of color, because I think they tend to be some of the most politically active of our voting groups and of our communities, but they have the least amount of overall representation in a variety of stances and issues. But we're looking at creating a fellowship that allows for young, talented individuals to go work on the Hill, particularly on Capitol Hill here in Washington, D.C. for a year, and then they come back to the Rainey Center and they work as fellows and they write for us and they attend events and they help create plans in which we will engage with sister organizations to find the type of solutions we seek. And the reason I say particularly women of color, because it's not simply about representation. It's also about the type of experiences they have had as individuals out in the world. And their voices tend to be much different from the traditional voices we see engaging in the development of policy and in political work early on in their careers and the overall arc of their careers. So if we're going to get them to a point in which they can regularly and easily be called upon as they become more senior within their careers, we have to ensure that they have opportunities to engage in the necessary prerequisites of that type of work earlier in their careers. And that's really what this fellowship is about. And, and we at Rainey are somewhat, selfish about this too, in the sense that not only do we get to see them grow and develop over their time if we're, able to bring this fellowship together, but then we get the benefit of having this new unique expert out in the world, and they can go on and maybe work in academia or work in a think tank or work in corporate or work in the public sector, but they're continuing to influence and to provide needed expertise to their community and help us close a lot of these gaps on representation and on the understanding of what representation means and why it's important. So many people that I've spoken with in the past tend to think that the idea of D&I and the idea of representation, or they call it about political correctness, and it's representation for the fact to say that I have someone Black working for me, and that's not the case at all. This is substantial to a diversity of thought issue. Bishop Garrison, a Black man that is a veteran that grew up in South Carolina, is going to have a much different view of the world based on the way I have been treated and the way I've grown in my environment than, say, you, Alex, or anyone else that might be a cisgender white male that has had certain opportunities afforded to them through that. That doesn't make their journey any more or less important than mine. It's just different, and we need more of that, of those types of differing opinions if we're going to find a variety of innovative solutions to all of the different problems facing us.
Obviously, I am an enormous fan of this initiative and of the fellowship. The Breakthrough Generation Summer Fellowship was kind of the first formal thing that the Breakthrough Institute did over 10 years ago. And, it's an annual summer fellowship. We get recent college grads and grad students to come join the research staff for the summer. And after 12 classes and over 100 fellows, I can at least promise you that it continues to sort of pay dividends in terms of learning for us, and obviously magnify or sort of compounding our impact in the world. And exactly what you say, that we're talking about more inclusion. We're talking about generational change, and the sort of next generation is the one that is going to lead that. So I would just do a little cross promotion for especially young listeners to apply to both the Rainey Center and Breakthrough Generations fellowships. Maybe one summer after the other if you're interested.
Yeah, and the best way, I think you've probably heard me beat this metaphor into the ground at this point, but I want people to understand that when we talk about diversity and inclusion and equitable treatment, we're not talking about think of it as a table. We're not talking about taking seats away or changing seats out so different people can sit. We're talking about building a bigger table to add more seats to have more voices as a part of the discussion. And to me, that's why this is so important.
Absolutely. Bishop, you mentioned at the top that you think of yourself as an optimist. So I want to close by asking for something real, something concrete in the world, in your work, in your life that gives you hope today.
Why can it be personal too? Can I talk about my son?
Absolutely.
It's a variety of things. One, I look at Gus, and he's right now he is 14 months old. And I look at the energy, the exuberance, the sheer pleasure and happiness he has in such simplistic things right now. And I see him as representative of what we can be and what we can accomplish. Nothing is set in stone. Nothing is already chipped out and, written out in granite. We have a variety of opportunities to change the direction of this country, of this environment, however we see fit. Is just a matter of us doing the hard work and coming together to make that happen. Just like if he is going to be successful in his life, which I will do everything I can to ensure he has the right opportunities to meet that success. But if he is going to be successful, he is going to have to work hard and take a lot of hits, but at the same time have a lot of positive outcomes and successes, and work with people within his environment and his community. So that's what gives me hope for the future. And quite frankly, having people on the other side, like Sarah Hunt and like many others, really do give me hope that we're going to be able to work together and bridge a lot of these divides that face us right now.
I often close this podcast by asking that question, and I gotta say, Gus is maybe my favorite answer yet.
He's mine. He's my answer for a lot of different things, and it makes me incredibly happy.
Wonderful. Well, Bishop Garrison, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to Breakthrough Dialogues. If you like our show, tell your friends, rate us, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Overcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. I want to again thank my guest Bishop and our producers Alyssa Kadaman and Tali Perlman. Catch you next time.